morning and welcome here to tonight's 5 by 15, and a big welcome especially to all our guest speakers tonight, who are, as you will see, a rich, varied and completely wonderful group of people who we're honoured and delighted to have joining us. So we're doing something a little bit different tonight. It's our version of Great Lives, and we have 5 extraordinary lives to talk about. These are lives that have cast long shadows, that are still influential today. They're extremely rich, they're extremely different, and they're extremely varied, as indeed are our speakers, who hail from all parts of Britain, and 2 we're very pleased to be welcoming from America. We're going to be looking tonight at a very renowned American novelist, an essayist, and political thinker and activist whose relevance to America today could not be more acute, as you will find out. We're going to be talking about an extraordinary artist of 16th century Germany, very controversial but important Empress of Russia, an early influential feminist in Australia, and an explorer whose daredevil deeds, quite frankly, defy any sort of logic or indeed any imagination, but rest assured, he did do it. All of the books that are written by tonight's authors are supremely worth having, so please don't hold back. They're all available from our bookstore, New Books. The details of all the books will be online as we go through. They'll be in the chat function, and we will, as ever, be recording tonight. And for people who have registered but aren't joining us, it's great to be able to watch it and catch up. So sit back and enjoy it, and you're going to have a really good time. First up tonight is Phillip Hall, who has come to 5 by 15 before when he talked about his extraordinary book, Leviathan, or The Whale. Philip's book went on to win the Samuel Johnson, and reviews like, you could only dream of, as indeed his new book, which is about Albert Jura, called Albert and the Whale, has also been similarly fated and has been selling, I know, extremely well. Philip is going to tell us about the significance and relevance of Albert, and indeed why on earth the word Albert and the Whale is there. We all know Philip has a thing about whales, but we're not quite sure whether Jura had one, although I have learned since reading the reviews and starting to read the book that in fact Jura once voyaged for 6 days to try to see a whale on a beach in Zealand. With no further ado, Philip, thank you very much for being with you, and the screen is yours. Welcome.
Thank you very much, Rosie. In July 1520, Albert Jura left his hometown of Nuremberg to travel by river all the way to the sea. From the dark heart of the continent and an imperial city-state full of power and technology, to the Low Countries, all of which lay beneath the sea. It was a long journey, but an urgent one. He had to leave, not, as history tells us, because he was seeking the patronage of the new Holy Roman Emperor, Charles V, who was about to be crowned, but because a virulent new wave of the plague had swept over Nuremberg. The city was under emergency administration. Anyone who could afford to was fleeing. All the rich merchants and bankers climbing in their helicopters and flying to the safer shores of the Netherlands and the healthy sea air. Jura arrived with his wife and maid in tow. It wasn't a close relationship. They ate in separate rooms. And waiting around for the coronation, he heard news of a much stranger visitor. Out on the shores of Zealand, that wasn't really land at all, a whale had been stranded. A vast leviathan, a mile long. It was an angler's exaggeration, but the villagers feared the very stink could kill them. Albert knew better than that. He'd read all about whales in his animal books. He knew they weren't sea dragons or hairy, scaly beasts spouting at the outer edge of space, but real, living and breathing creatures like himself. He'd even seen their bones hanging in Brussels town hall, of all places, masquerading as ancient giants. So Albert and his minted friends, drinking and gambling away their time in Antwerp, decided to go on a whale hunt. They had to go around it. It changed his life. As the ship neared the shore, a great storm blew up, real tempest stuff. Suddenly, everything was up in the air. Carried on by an onshore wind, the ship crashed onto the quayside, but long enough for most of the passengers to jump off, but not Albert. The ship blew black to sea, and it seemed all was lost. I imagine Shakespeare overhearing Albert telling the story in the pub, how he took control of the situation like a hero and brought the ship safely to shore, which he did. But in the greatest disappointment of all art history, the mysterious whale had been washed away by the same storm. Albert's great ambition had been thwarted. Perhaps it was hubris biting back. So why was Albert so desperate to see the whale? He wanted to collect it, of course. Jura was the first modern artist. We are shocked at the modernity of his gaze. He portrays animals with a lavish, intense, isolated detail that seems almost unnecessary. He gave them personhood, a sense of being in time and space. His hair twitches and crouches on her haunches on his kitchen floor. She quivers with life. Never mind that next minute she would be in the pot. Likewise, his clump of weeds, a sod of earth dug up from some sodden field. No one drew dirt before Jura. They didn't dare. It was blasphemous to challenge the hand of God. To declare any kind of equivalence between us and a bunny or a dandelion, letting fly its seeds on the warm summer air like a clock telling eternal time. He even painted the Big Bang, an exploding meteorite falling to Earth, a cosmic sign of the forthcoming apocalypse, like a cinema trailer for doom and dismay, or perhaps a new golden age. But most extraordinary of all was his rhino, a rhinoceros sent all the way from India by sea to King Manuel I of Portugal. No charismatic megafauna was ever so charismatic or so mega. Yet Jura never actually saw the living animal any more than he saw the whale. Instead, he relied on reports sent by his German agents, spies in the city of Lisbon. And from their rude sketches and descriptions, he created a rhinoceros that was more rhino than any real rhino could be. A plated, cratered, contoured animal, more like a map or a planet or an armored tank. Surreal. An image so vivid it would be reproduced in a 16th century Colombian villa as a Salvador Dali sculpture and on the bottle of wine I drank last night. This was the way the rhino looked for 400 years until David Attenborough came along. Jura was the first artist to reproduce his own work. That's why, as the art critic Laura Cummings says, he was the first international artist. Paintings were expensive, patrons annoying. Jura sidestepped that process. And in the process, his images outlived him. His rhino was still being printed using the same woodblocks long after he had died. art made Jura immortal. And as Timothy Morton, the modern philosopher, says, all art is from the future. That's why he wanted to draw the whale, to preserve it for eternity. And if he had, what then? Would we have seen these mysterious, beautiful beasts, all but invisible, but for their size, as if they were too dangerous to look upon in their reality? Would we have appreciated them for their holy presence, as emissaries from an as yet unspoiled ocean, Edenic ambassadors warning of the threats yet to come? Would Jura have saved the whale 500 years before Greenpeace? Was he the first friend of the earth? After all, art had saved him. He was his own natural history, recorded in portraits of himself. Number one, as a grungy, grumpy teenager in 1495, earbuds entwined in his red locks, a red jellyfish hat on his head. He's weedy but buff, proud of that chest, the off-the-shoulder shirt. Sheer bloody arrogance to spend all that time painting yourself, the one image you would never be able to sell. Number two, so he does it again. Fresh and sophisticated from Venice in 1498, where he learnt to fence and dance and acquired the alchemical secret of perspective. It's there in his hands, a thin white duke on the train, wearing Prada for the Passeggiata. Everything focuses on those hands, suave in their gloves. He's no mere artisan. Number three, the Leper Messiah, escaping the plague, 1500 at the century's turn. His revolutionary monogram AD announces a new age, before and after Jura. It's his portrait in the attic. Born in 1471, 29 years before, he will die in 1528, 29 years hence. He's halfway through his life. And look what he has achieved. He's at the peak of his powers. He will never not be famous from this moment on. But there's always some flaw in the firmament, some error in perfection, some fly in the ointment. He had a squint, one eye looking one way, the other way. Was that his secret? That he didn't see the way normal people did? Is that why his dog growled at this picture, this second Christ, this Janus looking back into the medieval past and into the impossible future? How I wish I could see it, Jura said. This physical beauty couldn't last. The irony is, his art killed him. Like a tubercular hero high on laudanum, stranded high on a magic mountain. That visit to the Low Countries had left him with a fever he couldn't shake. Was it malaria, bad air, caught from the Zeeland swamps? Or syphilis, a new import from the New World, along with all that stolen Aztec gold? Or was it a punishment from the Leviathan himself, star-born and star-cursed? Whatever the truth, Jura's fever took his life. At the end, he looked like a bundle of withered straw, his friends said. Another Christ, scourged and worn out. That wonky eye looking off to one side fearfully, as if he'd seen the avenging angel of history, his own fate. He died on the 6th of April, 1528, and was interred in a Nuremberg grave. His fans dug him up 3 days later to resurrect him. They needn't have bothered. They took plaster casts of his face and hands as if to cast a plaster saint. But it was a foolhardy and futile gesture. After all, He's still there on the wall, looking back at us. Look at those eyes again. They seem stranger than ever. So strange that in 1900, 400 years after the painting was made, a stranger strolled into the Munich gallery where the portrait hung and scratched out those eyes with a hatpin. It was a violent act, predictive of a violent century that would co-opt Jura's art for its own extreme means. The act of a mad Andalusian dog. And yet, in those eyes, in which we see the whole world reflected, Jura endures. And he leaves us with the questions he asked in the first place. Can art save us? Is it a curse? What is beauty? He paused only long enough to answer himself. I don't know, he said.
Oh, Philip, that was just amazing. Thank you so much. I think everyone will be rushing to buy the book. Those eyes are quite extraordinary. It's really hard to figure that they actually are a painting and not a photograph. Anyway, thank you again. Thank you very, very much for being here. We're now going to talk about someone who's pretty different, but equally as important and equally as influential, especially right now. We're going to hear now about James Baldwin, one of the most influential Americans of the 20th century. His ideas, his activism reaches down through the years, and in fact could not be more important today, right now, as it was when he wrote it. Today in America, all the points that Baldwin made about race and racism in the country, you understand completely why he was called the poet for the revolution. Now, this best-selling book, Begin Again, written by Eddie Glaude, has been dominating New York bestseller lists, and I'm really pleased to say it's now out here in the UK and you can get it. Eddie is professor and chair of the Department of African American Studies at Princeton, and he's joining us from just outside Princeton on what is an incredibly busy day for him. I know he was at a press conference early this morning talking about the latest police shooting of an unarmed, very young 20-year-old black man. Thank you very much, Eddie, for taking the time to be with us. And I know we're all really looking forward to hearing what James Baldwin's lessons would be for all of us right now today. Over to you. Thank you.
Thank you so much. My mother is fond of telling a story from when I was a baby. My father had just returned from Vietnam, a bit edgy, I suppose. They were asleep. But my crib was next to the bed, and my mother always giggles when she gets to this part. You woke up and wanted our attention, she says. So you started to shake the bottle on your dad's face. Then my dad interrupts her as usual. I kept feeling something wet on my face, he said. The next thing I know, my mother says, I see my baby in his onesie with his little legs swinging back and forth. Your dad had snatched you up in the air, screaming. They laugh. I shudder. From an early age, my father deposited fear in my gut. With a glance, he could freeze me in place. Just a slight raise in his voice could bring me to tears. And ever since I can remember remembering, I've been trying to prove that I'm not a coward. That the fear that he put deep down in my belly doesn't control me. I suppose that's why I was initially hesitant to read James Baldwin. I knew he would ask something of me that I wasn't prepared to give. I would have to deal with my pain, my sense of wounding, with the trauma that stands as my scene of instruction. So I evaded Baldwin's work. I preferred Ralph Ellison. His mask fit perfectly. Ellison, the author of Invisible Man, Shadow and Act, and Going to the Territory, offered a sophisticated treatment of the race problem in the United States and that left the ground fertile. His nonfiction essays brimmed with philosophical and literary rigor, and I could read them with my white classmates without having to manage their discomfort. Baldwin was different. He left faces flushed or crimson red. It was bad enough that Baldwin forced me back onto myself, but reading him with my white colleagues meant that I had to manage whatever he made them feel. Obviously, I overcame my hesitation, and I've been reading and teaching Baldwin ever since, particularly as nonfiction, for about 20 years now. And as I found myself despairing and disillusioned after the election of Donald Trump, repeatedly saying to myself, they've done it again, they've done this shit again, I've reached for Baldwin to help me pick up the pieces. My pieces, our pieces. To help me imagine how to push this damn boulder up the hill again. Baldwin had gone through this too. He watched as America turned its back on the promise of the Black freedom struggle of the mid-20th century. He collapsed after the assassination of Dr. King, wondering out loud, as Toni Morrison's character Stampede did in Beloved, what are these people? What are they? And he had to figure out how to pick himself up. Baldwin tried to commit suicide in '69. By 1970, he was barely holding himself together. So not only did he have to figure out how to pick himself up, but how to pick us up, because we still had the responsibility, even if white folk refused to stop being white folk. We had the responsibility of raising our babies, of imagining the country anew for them. I knew this, even in my despair and disillusionment. I knew this, so I rummaged through the ruins of Baldwin's work, and there I found what became Begin Again. The first book Baldwin wrote after Dr. King's assassination was No Name in the Street, published in 1972. That book has fascinated me over the years. It is a book about trauma. Baldwin is trying to hold himself together in the shadow of the dead and broken. He sought to tell a story about the past that would at least give us some sense of direction in an uncertain moment. The book folds back on itself. He misremembers. Narrating trauma fragments how we remember. We recall what we can and what we desperately need to keep ourselves together. Wounds, historical and painfully present, threaten to rend the soul. And if that happens, nothing else matters. Telling the story of trauma then in fits and starts isn't quite history in any formal sense. It is the way traumatic memory works. Recollections caught in the pitched battle between remembering and forgetting. Facts bungled on behalf of much needed truths. We try to keep our heads above water and tell ourselves a story that keeps our legs and arms moving below the surface and keeps the terror, stories that keep the terror from overwhelming everything. As Baldwin wrote in his last book, The Evidence of Things Not Seen, quote, terror cannot be remembered. One blots it out, end quote. The cruel irony, of course, is that the terrors move us about. We dig trenches to redirect the memories and to get them to flow away from us. But like the waters of the Mississippi River, the memories always return, flooding everything, no matter how high we build the stilts. No Name in the Street, this book published after the murder of Dr. King, after Jimmy's attempted suicide in '69, No Name in the Street is the spine of Begin Again. Baldwin's formal innovations in the text, his rejection of linear narrative, his engagement with fragmented memory shape how I engage this moment, our moment. The lie that rests at the heart of my country continues to leave bodies in its wake. That lie which holds that America is some shining city on the hill, a beacon of democratic virtue, maintains a kind of illusory innocence that has made this place, my country, monstrous. Baldwin relentlessly exposed the lie that hid this insidious idea that white people ought to be valued more than others, an idea that America has in some ways fine-tuned, but it is our inheritance. We get it from you. This idea, he maintained, and I insist we must acknowledge, has distorted American democratic life and disfigured the souls of those who cleave to it. And nothing, Baldwin insisted, and I want to insist today, nothing will change in this place, in this house of horrors, until we honestly confront who we are. We cannot tell ourselves a story of American virtue that secures our innocence. For Baldwin, quote, the country will not change until it re-examines itself and discovers what it really means by freedom, end quote. And that will involve, among other things, telling itself the truth, or better, no longer lying to itself about what it has done and what it continues to do. An essay published in 1964 with Richard Avington, an essay entitled Nothing Personal, Baldwin put the point succinctly, quote, we are afraid to reveal ourselves because we trust ourselves so little. And in this labyrinth, the person is desperately trying not to find out what he really thinks. Therefore, the truth cannot be told, even about one's attitudes. We live by lies. And not only, for example, about race, whatever by this time in this country, or indeed in the world, this word may mean, but about our very natures. The lie has penetrated our most private moments and the most secret chambers of our hearts, end quote. The United States has never been a beacon of virtue. It's not an example of democracy achieved, nor is it the shining city on the hill. We tell ourselves these stories in order to protect ourselves from what we have done. Baldwin understood that our problems in the United States go well beyond who occupies the White House or the latest example of American racism. We have to get to the rot at the heart of the matter. And this requires that we deconstruct all that the nation holds sacred, that we tell the truth so that we might release ourselves into a different way of being in the world. Americans are trapped in a history we refuse to know but carry within us. The terrors and panics we experience have everything to do with the gap between who we imagine ourselves to be and who deep down we really are. And that the nation actively evades confronting this gap locks the country into a kind of perpetual adolescence where those who desperately hold on to the American myth as some kind of New World Eden refuse to grow up. And for Baldwin, condemnation to eternal youth is a synonym for corruption. Imagine being stuck forever in Never Never Land. I can't help but connect this insight to what we witnessed over the four years of Donald Trump's presidency and over the last few months in this country, what we're witnessing now as another Black woman has to bury her child. Americans who refuse to grow up revel in the fantasy that ours must remain a white nation in the vein of old Europe. All along, at least to me, Trumpism feels as if a kind of suppressed terror and pain lurks beneath the surface of the rants and hatreds, that the seams are unraveling and revealing the true monstrosity hidden behind a cheap-ass MAGA hat and t-shirt. But what I've learned from Baldwin is that we mustn't hide from our fears. We must run towards them. That can help us grow up. Running towards our fears can release us from those terrors that move us about. But the necessary condition for this to happen is that we tell ourselves the truth, and then a bit more. America has to choose whether it will finally become a genuinely multiracial democracy, and this involves grappling with the past that continues to haunt our present living. We have to recognize that the trouble, as Baldwin said, is deeper than we wish to think, because the trouble is in us. We must understand that imagining America anew is a moral and ethical undertaking. It must be the result of the examination of ourselves, free of the myths of America, an examination that opens up a new pathway for being otherwise. We have to run toward our fears. I barely survived writing this book in the end. Baldwin asked much of me as I sat down to write with him about our times. The sentences weren't dancing initially. The ideas weren't coming. It was only after I dealt with my trauma, my wounding, my pain. And Jimmy said to me in a voice, quote, "If we're going to do this together, old boy, you will have to deal with you." I had to run towards my fear, to admit that I'm a wounded boy with daddy issues. And that is a lesson. The unexamined life is not worth living. A precondition to say anything about the world is that you must first deal with you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Eddie. That was just wonderful. Yes, the unexamined life is not worth living. I think that probably all the people we're talking about tonight made great strides to examine their lives. I certainly know that it's true of the next speaker, but just before I leave you, please, everyone, the book details for Eddie's wonderful book about James Baldwin, Begin Again, are online now, and thank you. Our next speaker is Polly Samson, again, another not a stranger to 5x15, and she's been here before to talk about other various books, but we're really thrilled tonight that she's going to be here talking about her book, A Theatre for Dreamers, Sunday Times bestseller when it came out last year, just out in paperback today. And after Polly's spoken, I'm going to give you details of a really great offer that we're putting together about the person Polly's talking about, books and Polly's. So Polly's going to talk about a woman called Charmian Cliff, who was an Australian who found herself on the island of Hydra in the 1960s, was an extraordinarily influential writer. She was a muse. She was at the center of an enormous intrigue that happened on the little island of Hydra. And she went on in the last years of her life to become one of the most influential feminist writers and commentators in Australia. Polly, so to speak, met her spiritually, and decided to make her the heroine of her wonderful book, A Theatre for Dreamers. So Polly, welcome from Sussex, and we're so glad to have you with us tonight. Over to you.
Thank you, Rosie. Actually, I have Rosie to thank for introducing me to Charmian, and in both my life and my imagination, because it was actually Rosie who suggested I go to Hydra, and this was in 2014. I had a bunch of little children all about to have their half-term holiday, and that usual thing, I'd finished a book, I hadn't thought really about what to do. We all wanted to go and just sort of get some sun, and Rosie said, go to Hydra, it's fantastic. So we did, and it is a lovely place, and I had no thoughts of writing about it. I don't think I even knew, although I'm a huge Leonard Cohen fan, I think on that occasion I didn't know that it was the island that Leonard Cohen had made his home. I mean, I knew all of his lyrics, but I didn't know that's where he lived. I think I knew very little about his life, and I knew absolutely nothing about Charmian Cliff. And this is Charmian Cliff. This is her second memoir that she wrote of a decade that she spent in Greece, in a world pre-mass tourism. It's that picture that first really drew me in. I mean, it is an extraordinary author photograph, really sort of somehow harrowing and yet inviting of, you know, wanting just to know this woman, really. And it's a very odd choice as an author picture. It's a very odd choice as a cover picture for a book. It's kind of intriguing because it looks like she has a black eye. She looks like she's challenging the photographer. The photographer was a very great stills photographer called Lieselotte Strello. And I've been unable to find out actually how Lieselotte Strello came to take that picture. But Hydra, at that point in 1959, there had been a couple of big films made there, including Sophia Loren's first big Hollywood movie, Boy on a Dolphin. So maybe that is connected to it. Anyway, but it was the writing in this book that hooked me more than anything. She has an incredible way of drawing the reader in. She's a very intimate writer. It's a book about making a go of things with her family. She had two small children. She was married to the Australian writer George Johnston. It's a sort of cast of international extras because a lot of people had started going to Hydra to live cheaply, to make art, to write books. It's a kind of sexed up Durrells with plenty of brilliantly expressed sort of existential angst, and she's got a wicked wit. I mean, she really sort of takes the mickey out of the other people on the island. Anyway, we were there for that week, and then back home with Google, I discovered that her writing career had begun collaboratively with her husband, George Johnston. Now, he had been a famous war reporter in Australia. He was 10 years older than Charmian. And they had written 3 novels together, and she was the less famous half of this writing couple. And that sort of drew me in, because I've written collaboratively with my husband, I mean, not novels, but songs. And so I was interested in that dynamic. And so when I looked into it more, actually what I found was one of the most tragic stories I've ever read. Charmian Cliff and George Johnston was dubbed the Ted and Sylvia of Australia. And depending on whose biography you read, fingers were pointed each at the other for being responsible for the early death of the other. I mean, it's a terrible story. Second picture. There she is, looking more, I think, like herself. And so that you can see what a strange choice it was to put that picture on the front of her memoir. Here she is. If she was overshadowed in life by the man she married, in death, she was massively eclipsed by her friend on the island, who was Leonard Cohen, who would consign her really to being a footnote in his story. He arrived on the island in 1960. George and Charmian had already been there for 4 years. And he went there to live cheaply and to write his first novel. He had an address that he'd been given to stay at of the artist Geeka, who had a grand house on the island in those days. But he was turned away, and I haven't really got time to tell you that story, but it is in my novel, and it's a kind of interesting story. But Charmian and George came to the rescue, as they did with many of the young people who turned up on the island, and they took him in and helped him to find another place. And 2 decades later, when he played his first Australian concert, he dedicated it to the couple, who he said had taught him everything he had ever learned about being a writer. And tragically, they had already been dead for a decade by then. So this is a happier picture. This is Charmian, George, Marianne, Elon, and Leonard. The child is Jason Johnston, who was born on the island to Charmian and George. He's their 3rd child. And it was really lucky for me that these photographs existed, because it was a gateway to a labyrinth. So what had happened was that in 1960, an old war reporting buddy of George Johnston's had been living in Athens and had been commissioned by Life magazine to do a photo essay of this sort of burgeoning community. And it's the fact that Leonard Cohen is in these photographs that has meant that they are discoverable on the internet. Not all 1,573 of them, I might add, but a few of them, the ones actually with Leonard Cohen in them. It's an extraordinary set of photographs. The essay never appeared, but when I sort of was alerted to them and I had already become very interested in this community, they were an amazing aid to both writing the novel and also researching the novel, because my first job really was to discover who all the people were. So if we have the next picture. So here are a group of this circle of fabled beings at the taverna, where allegedly Leonard Cohen gave his first concert. You can see here we have Klaus, we have Charles Hextall, then Leonard playing the guitar. Next to him is Charmian, George lighting a cigarette. There's Marianne Elon and Axel Jensen, who was soon to be her ex-husband. At the point this photograph is taken, it's a sort of amazing turn of events. He has actually said, "So long, Marianne," and left her for another woman, left her, in fact, with a small baby. But Leonard had just arrived on the island a few months earlier and has kind of taken up his responsibilities while Axel has kind of disappeared, comes and goes. The great thing about being able to identify all of these people is that they all left quite rich archives, and you know, there are published novels, there are unpublished novels, and they did all write about each other, both on the lines and between the lines. And so for a novelist, it was a very, very rich labyrinth of material. So next picture. Yes, I mean, in that year, 1960, not only had this terrible thing happened between Marianne and Axel, this sort of triangle, and Leonard arriving, but George had just published a novel which exposed Charmian's infidelity. It was kind of non-stop drama. Anyway, here is my novel, A Theatre for Dreamers, out this week in paperback, and Charmian's books. Now, this is a really wonderful thing because Charmian Cliff has been out of print in this country for 20 years. And it is extraordinary that a writer of this quality with such amazing things to say, not just about Greece in the pre-mass terrorism era, but also about women's lives generally, that she should be out of print is extraordinary. And it is so wonderful that Muswell Press has put her back into print with these wonderful editions. And you can see here there's also a CD, which is because when I'd finished the novel, David and I, who'd collaborate on songs, were then inspired to write a song. And then I did the audiobook and David wrote some music. And so that's what that's all about. So Mermaid Singing, which you can see there, was her debut book, which was written without George. And it's about their first year in Greece, which was on the island of Kalymnos, which was an island that was going through some very, very interesting times. It was an island that relied on the sponge diving industry, and the sponge diving industry was dying. I will read you a little piece from it because it's the best way to give you a flavour of Charmian. She managed 2 novels in their time, in their decade on Greece, before she returned to Australia and found fame for the remaining 5 years of her tragically short life as a columnist, campaigner and commentator. Anyway, I will read you a little bit because it's quite prophetic, I think. She talked about how George and she could make this work, but she sort of did have a sense of what might happen to her. We are both writers. Indeed, 3 of our novels, including the one we are working on at the time, were written in collaboration. It's the only workable arrangement. But I have a faint, gnawing suspicion that there will come a time when I will somehow find myself several paces in the rear, watching the flick of his keychain and quite unable to catch up because of the weight of the baggage I am carrying. When they went back to Australia, George Johnston was very ill. He had TB. He managed to write 2 novels that both won the Miles Franklin Award. She wrote, amazingly, 240 brilliant essays. She had a powerful progressive voice. She campaigned for the return of democracy to Greece. She was pro-abortion. She was pro-women's rights to birth control, against the lottery barrel conscription and the war in Vietnam. She was a powerful voice, and she had a really, really great readership. So I think it's really lovely to sort of remember her more as this person than the photograph we saw at the beginning. This is her in the early 50s when they did a sort of recce and they went to some Greek islands to look for which would be their paradise. And I will read you one more piece by her, which is from, these are still sadly out of print. These are, there are 4 books of her essays, which you actually can get hold of. And I just like how she writes about, I've got it all out of order. Right, here we go. She says, "It is the most pretentious nonsense to believe that the work you do will live after you. It might, but then again, it might not. And history will be the judge of that, not you. What most of us leave to posterity are only a few memories of ourselves, really, and possibly a few enemies. A whole human life of struggle, bravery, defeat, triumph, hope, despair might be remembered finally for one drunken escapade. Now, in July 1969, and following a day of drunken rowing with George, Charmian Cliff ended her own life by overdosing on his sleeping pills. George Johnston died of TB 1 year later. I am so glad that she is not forgotten. She is such an immersive writer and the best companion anyone could wish for. Do read her and be transported to the Greek islands, away from these times as well as these shores. Thank you.
Thank you, Polly. That was fantastic. And I read Peel Me a Lotus, and I can vouch for the fact that it's an absolutely wonderful book, and so is Mermaid Singing. Now, the package that I mentioned before Polly spoke was what you saw in that slide. So for 30 quid, you get Polly's book, both of Charmian's, and a copy of the CD of David Gilmour's singing with Romany, his daughter, and lyrics that Polly wrote, which are based on a Leonard Cohen, and it's called Yes, I Have Ghosts, and that's going to be chucked in just for free. But I think we only have 30, so as they might say, hurry while stocks last, because it's a really great package of things to read. Now, we're going off in a completely different direction now to be with Ed Caesar in his quite extraordinary book that he has written about Britain's most mysterious mountaineering legend, who's called Maurice Wilson. To say anything about him rather gives away the plot of his quite extraordinary life, but can we say aeroplanes, flying on your own, crashes, Mount Everest, attempt, etc. This is a story of heroism, madness, definitely, as Polly was quoting from the book Peel Me a Lotus, about, you know, will your deeds be forgotten? I think it's quite wonderful, Ed, that you have rescued Maurice Wilson from obscurity, because this is a truly extraordinary story. I suppose it is a very English story, but I think I only mean that in terms of its deep eccentricity. Ed himself is a multi-award winning writer who's won, I think, 11 separate awards for his journalism. He's a contributor to The New Yorker. And this is an extraordinary book with quite wonderful pictures, which we're going to be lucky enough to see a few of. So Ed, over to you for this magical and amazing story. And thank you very much for joining us. Well, from Manchester, where I think it's a bit chillier than we are, but welcome, and the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Rosie. Mountains don't need people. People need mountains. And in the next few minutes, I'm going to ask you to think about why that might be so. Here is a picture, I hope, of a British Everest party in 1933 at the Rongbuk Monastery in Tibet. The great mountain looms in the background. An unforgettable and harrowing adventure on its slopes awaits the climbing party in the foreground. So let me ask again, why do people need mountains? When George Mallory, the handsome doomed alpinist of the 1920s, was asked by a New York Times reporter why he wanted to climb Everest, he famously replied, because it's there. He went on, Everest is the highest mountain in the world. Its existence is a challenge. The answer is instinctive, a part, I suppose, of man's desire to conquer the universe. And Mallory's answer is often quoted. Because it's there has become a mantra for adventurers ever since. But from what I know of Mallory, I find this sentiment a little uncharacteristic. In his famous response, the attempt to climb Everest is seen as part of a challenge thrown down to mankind by the planet itself. Mallory's language is martial. His mission is no less to subjugate the universe. If such a challenge existed in the 1920s, it was only in the minds of a few Europeans. Alpinism had only really existed as a sport since the mid-19th century, and Everest had been considered as a target for climbers only since the turn of the 20th. What's more, the Himalayan peoples who had lived in sight of Chomolungma, the goddess mother of the skies, as they called Everest, had done so for millennia without feeling the urge to climb to its summit. Everest was also a peculiarly British obsession. Our adventurers had been beaten to the North and South Poles by men from other nations. They had made it their business to reach the top of Everest, or the third pole as it became known. The project became one of national importance. bound up with imperial longings. But was the desire to climb Everest only about planting a Union flag at 29,000 feet? Was something else going on? Mountains don't need people. People need mountains. 5 years before, Because It's There, Mallory had written in a quite different mode about the appeal of climbing mountains. He had just ascended Mont Blanc by the Col de Géant. In the Alpine Journal, he wrote this beautiful passage. Have we vanquished an enemy? None but ourselves. Have we gained success? That word means nothing here. Have we won a kingdom? No. And yes, we have achieved an ultimate satisfaction, fulfilled a destiny, to struggle and to understand. Never this last without the other, such is the law. Hold that thought. Have we vanquished an enemy? None but ourselves. And now consider Maurice Wilson, the subject of my book, The Moth and the Mountain. Wilson was the son of a mill owner from Bradford. In 1933, when he was 35 years old, he attempted to fly a gypsy moth biplane in stages to Everest, to land his plane at the foot of the great mountain, and then to climb to the summit alone. He had no mountaineering experience. He had only recently learned to fly a plane. But Wilson was deadly serious about his mission. I became fascinated by Wilson about 10 years ago when I read a short passage about him in another book about Everest. His adventure began to haunt me. Why, I wondered, would anyone do something so foolhardy? In 1933, Everest remained unconquered. It had killed many people who had attempted to climb it. So what was Wilson, an amateur with no experience, doing trying to climb this mountain, and in such an eccentric way? Answering that question was the work of many years of archival trawls on 3 continents, of poring over letters and ship's manifests, of reading the handwritten diary that Wilson took with him to Everest. A rich and occasionally confounding portrait of Wilson emerged. But one line from his Everest diary stood out. In 1934, as Wilson was looking at the terrifying north face of the mountain, the same mountain he was about to climb with scant help and lacking key pieces of equipment, the same mountain that had killed Mallory, he wrote, 16 years since I went into the line in France for stunt. The stunt of which Wilson wrote was his heroic action in the First World War, for which he won his military cross. On the 25th of April, 1918, during the decisive German Spring Offensive, Wilson, a 20-year-old second lieutenant with the West Yorkshire Regiment, survived on a day when hundreds of men from his battalion died. As his battalion was overrun, Wilson stayed ahead of the front line for hours, firing on the enemy, before eventually retreating to rejoin the battered remnants of his unit. It was a miracle that he survived that day without a scratch on his body. And when Wilson returned from the war some months later, injured this time by gunshot near Ypres, he came back to a city in mourning. This is a picture of Wilson taken at that time. You can see him wearing his military cross ribbon for bravery. Before the war, Bradford had been one of the most exciting places in Britain to live, perhaps in the world. It was the capital of the wool trade. It had a magnificent sporting and musical scene. It fostered talents from science to the arts. But after the war, it was a town of widows. On Cecil Avenue, Wilson's Road, half the young men were dead. Others had become husks of their former selves. Wilson's older brother, Victor, had also fought in the war. He was so badly affected by shell shock, what we would now call PTSD, that he shook constantly and was assailed by nightmares. Maurice Wilson itched to be free of so much sadness. He ran away to New Zealand. He ran away from one wife and then from another. He ran into the arms of many other young women. He ran to nightclubs and to horse races. He ran to America and to Mozambique. He ran into the arms of spiritualists and quacks. He ran into Madame Blavatsky's theosophists and into an intermittent regime of fasting inspired by Oxford group Christians and, improbably enough, by Mahatma Gandhi. And eventually, in 1932, while fasting in the Black Forest in Germany, he hit upon the idea of running to Everest. No matter that he didn't have the skills, Wilson could learn. No matter that he didn't have a plane, Wilson could buy one. No matter that Everest had killed so many before him, Wilson would be fitter and hardier than those that had gone before him. Faith, he wrote to his lover, Enid Evans, moves mountains. If the psychological connection between Wilson's wartime service and his attempt on Everest seemed obvious to me, it was equally clear that Wilson did not want to climb the mountain for reasons of national pride. Yes, he carried a Union flag in his backpack as protocol demanded, but it was signed by his friends, and he referred to the pennant as his flag of friendship. Despite his experiences in the First World War, he retained a love for Germany, spoke its language fluently, and spent happy holidays there after the war. Nor was he an imperialist. When he was on his adventure, he treated the local people equitably. He treated them as friends. How bloody awful it must be to be brought up a snob, he wrote in his diary. When an earthquake shook Darjeeling, he was preparing his final foray on foot to Everest, but he was the only white man who helped to sift through the rubble alongside Indians. The gold cross that he wore around his neck bore the inscription Amor vincit omnia, love conquers all. So to use Mallory's framing, the thing Wilson was attempting to conquer on Everest was himself. Here's Wilson in his gypsy moth, being waved off from London by his friends. I love this picture because he never looks happier than in this moment, the hero of his own story. I shall let you read the book to discover what became of Wilson and his crazy adventure. No spoilers here. But perhaps I could leave you with this thought. Wilson often spoke of his Everest attempt as the stunt or the show. Such theatrical terms were a hangover from the First World War, when soldiers referred to battles in such terms. A battle was the show, a trench raid was an entertainment. That Wilson also used this language to discuss his attempts on Everest seems to me instructive. Mountains don't need us, but they do provide a stage on which men and women act, or a plot in which they become the heroes. And it strikes me that all such adventures are suffused with this spiritual aspect, because the journey undertaken is both real and really dangerous and metaphorical. It is the profoundly unreflective alpinist who does not consider why he has put himself in the way of so much harm for so little tangible gain. To struggle and to understand, never this one without the other, such is the law, wrote Mallory. Ernest Shackleton, the Antarctic explorer of the early 20th century, wrote as interestingly about this fusing of physical endeavor and self-knowledge as anybody. In 1916, just as Maurice Wilson was signing his army conscription papers at the barracks in Bradford, Shackleton was just reaching safety in South Georgia with his tiny group of survivors, having endured scarcely believable hardships. He wrote this moving passage. At the bottom of the fall, we were able to stand again on dry land. The rope could not be recovered. We had flung down the axe from the top of the fall, and also the logbook and the cooker wrapped in one of our blouses. That was all except our wet clothes that we brought out of the Antarctic, which we had entered a year and a half before with well-found ship, full equipment and high hopes. That was all of tangible things, but in memories, we were rich. We had pierced the veneer of outside things. We had suffered, starved, and triumphed, groveled down yet grasped at glory, grown bigger in the bigness of the whole. We had seen God in his splendors, heard the text that nature renders. We had reached the naked soul of man. Maurice Wilson was a restless, lovelorn, stubborn, damaged, beguiling man. But by undertaking his great adventure, he also reached his naked soul. After an adulthood of fleeing meaningful human connections, he wrote home before his final push into Tibet. The greatest power on earth is love, provided it is love of good and not selfish. What a pity more people don't know it. It struck me reading that letter that long before he even arrived at the foot of Everest, Wilson had conquered a mountain known only to him.
Ed, thank you so much. That was quite wonderful. I'm so glad that you have rescued Maurice Wilson from oblivion, where presumably he would be if you hadn't written this fantastic book. The Moth and the Mountain is out now, and the details, all the details are in the chat. So as I'm sure you all want to know what happened, I know what happened because I've read it. I'm not going to tell you either, so you've just got to buy it. Anyway, thank you very much indeed. And our next speaker, I'm thrilled that Linda Colley is joining us, also from the East Coast of America, and where it is now probably long after lunch. Linda, thank you so much, and I hope you've enjoyed listening to everyone else. Linda is a powerful, award-winning historian and thinker. She is a lecturer at Princeton, and she has just produced a book called The Gun, the Ship and the Pen: Warfare, Constitutions and the Making of the Modern World. And this is literally about how constitutions and words have defined how we think, how we live, and how we have attempted to run our societies. She covers an absolutely vast canvas in this book. And so what she's going to do tonight is to talk about one particular character, Empress Catherine the Great of Russia, who was herself a real pioneer in trying to work out how you would write something like a constitution. And she was busy doing this long before the founding fathers had even got their pens out of their pockets. Linda, thank you very much for being with us, and I hand the screen over to you with great pleasure. Welcome.
Thank you very much. Well, hello everyone. And so what do most of us know about Catherine the Great? Well, many of us may know, as we've been told, that she's Empress of Russia. Indeed, she's a very long reigning Empress of Russia, taking the throne in 1762 and keeping it despite opposition until her death in 1796. But I suspect that rather more people know about Catherine something of the scandals, the many scandals that surrounded her during her life. She produced at least 2 illegitimate children. And in 1762, quite outrageously, she helped dethrone her husband, the Tsar of Russia, Peter III. And not only did she force him to abdicate, she probably was complicit subsequently in getting him strangled, at which point she did not pass the throne on to her possibly legitimate son. No, she seized the throne for herself. Moreover, for the rest of her life, she took a succession of lovers, many of whom were younger than herself. Now, of course, for a political ruler to take lovers younger than themselves is not unknown even now. But these are escapades which may be accepted of male rulers. But Catherine was female, and therefore it was considered much less acceptable. And could I have the first slide, please? And this is an example of a great deal of contemporary commentating on the kind of person Catherine was seen as being. It's a print published in France in 1792. And as you can see, in it, Catherine is bare-breasted. She is striding across the image. And beneath her in a row are her fellow monarchs, all males, who are engaged in looking up her skirts and making comments that I will not translate. But of course, this image is an ambivalent one, because what also emerges from it is just how powerful, how aggressive Catherine is, how much she dominates this satirical picture. The male monarchs may be upskirting her, but she is dwarfing them as she strides from Russia to Constantinople, the capital of the Ottoman Empire with which she was at war. And this despite the fact, the way that she bestrides this image, she was actually quite a small woman, but here she appears large. Now, I came across Catherine in a new way recently in my last book, which has just come out. And as you've heard, it's called The Gun, the Ship and the Pen, Warfare, Constitutions, and the Making of the Modern World. And what the book is about is an exploration of why it was that single document political constitutions began to proliferate across the globe at a growing pace after 1750, and how this process was intimately connected with the changing nature of warfare. Now, partly because this is a book about warfare, a book about constitution writing, most of my characters are necessarily masculine. So one of the reasons why looking at Catherine the Great appealed to me was that she was a female character. And I was very eager that a female should appear in the dominant characters of this book. But there was another reason why I wanted to talk about her, and it's conveyed in the next picture. So could we see that, please? And here is a picture of Catherine, about the age of 40 she was then, or already slightly overweight, highly coloured, which she liked, writing the document that became the Nakaz. And this is how I describe this painting, which is not a very good one, but is an important one. Framed in metal and less than 4 inches by 8 inches in size, the painting is amateurish in style and overly busy. There is a cluttered royal apartment, complete with pillars, scarlet curtains, and a velvet upholstered throne. And there is a bust of Peter the Great, the most titanic of Russian czars, a reformer and a warmonger. The bust is positioned so that its stone eyes appear to look approvingly across at the woman seated at the center of the picture, working at a gilded writing desk. She, meanwhile, turns away from her papers to gaze uncompromisingly outwards. This is Catherine II of Russia. And as I say, this is not a great painting. It's a fascinating one. You can see it at the State Hermitage in St. Petersburg. But it's a very, very important image in world history, because this is one of the very rarest images before the First World War of someone who is female engaged in compiling a political, legal, and constitutional text of considerable importance. And Catherine worked very, very hard at this document, and she worked overwhelmingly by herself. She had a secretary who helped her with the copying, but we know that for almost 2 years, from about 1763 to 1764, she would get up morning after morning, about 4 o'clock a.m., so that she could get some pages written in advance of undertaking all the other regal duties she had. And indeed, as she wrote, and she wrote so much, she started developing eye strain. And the nakaz is a huge document. It's well over 650 clauses. So what is the nakaz? Well, I stress it's not a written constitution as such. Catherine is an absolutist monarch. And in the end, moreover, the nakaz, the terms it contained, were not implemented in Russia itself. But the nakaz is still important in many, many ways. It's important because it's an extraordinarily ambitious document, ambitious in economic terms, in social terms, in educational terms. It's not just a legal text. One of the things that Catherine says in it, for example, that it's not enough for people to be charitable to the poor. Governments themselves have to undertake welfare policies so that nobody falls below a certain level of competence and economic well-being. Moreover, it didn't just stay in Russia, and it didn't just stay in manuscript. It was published in at least 10 languages. It passed through at least 26 editions by 1800, and it had a real impact internationally on constitutional and legal ideas among Catherine's fellow rulers, but also among Enlightenment intellectuals, because Catherine was a well-read woman and had borrowed extensively on Enlightenment thought. This is what Voltaire, a friend of Catherine, said, and he was being somewhat over-complimentary, but not entirely so. He described the nakaz as a document which ought to belong to all the kings and tribunals in the world. A dangerous book, an advanced book, which is quite a commendation from Voltaire. Moreover, in 1767, Catherine went on to summon a legislative commission to Moscow to discuss the nakaz. And this was an extraordinary body. It was very widely voted for, including indirectly by some women. It included Muslims as well as Christians. And in some ways, this commission in Moscow, held in 1767, is a forerunner of later constitutional conventions, of, for example, the Great Constitutional Convention that's going to be held in Philadelphia in 1787 to draft the American Constitution. So looking at that not very good, not very accomplished, but fascinating image of Catherine inscribing her nakaz reminds us of a lot of things. It reminds us surely that there are other sides to this extraordinary woman, that she was not just a body and not just, in addition, a great art patron and cultivated person. Catherine was also a mind, a brain, and a considerable writer. The later American philosopher Hannah Arendt had an interesting phrase where she describes as a written document as, quote, an endurable, objective thing. Well, Catherine's nakaz was not objective. It reflects her own priorities and tastes, but it's a document that should endure, and it should make us look at the history of constitutions differently, and Catherine the Great differently too.
Oh, Linda, thank you. That was fantastic. I didn't know all that side of her, and that's wonderful that there was a woman doing that and also being able to be powerful and slightly cruel as well at the same time. It's a very interesting painting of her as well, and the cartoon's extraordinary. I would like to read all the comments, and I was trying to do that, but of course I failed, but I will look them up. Anyway, thank you so very much for joining us, and your book is available through our bookstore, The Gun, the Ship and the Pen, Warfare, Constitutions and the Making of the Modern World. It's absolutely a good read and I recommend it to everyone. So thank you very much to Linda, to Ed, to Philip, to Polly and to Eddie. Thank you so much for bringing us the legacy and the story and the inspiration of all the people that you have written about so beautifully, and it is very moving to hear these stories and to feel connected with them across the ages. So I'm really grateful to you all for being here, and I'm sorry that we're not able to see you in person, but one day soon we will. Please join us 5x15 on Wednesday if you have the time. We've got the 6th in our series of the Earth Convention. This one is about how to live in sustainable cities in the future. In the meantime, please check out the chat, please get the books, and have a good evening. And thank you all very, very much indeed for joining us. Stay safe and stay well. Bye-bye.